Alright guys, welcome to the fourth round of IMU and also the final and silent round. My name is Gary, paneling with me is Anisha and Sean. In opening government, we have IM Dr. Brown, I'm linguist, in closing government SPA, in closing opposition Len 18. In motion, this house will shut down social network sites in times of emergency by the Prime Minister. Okay.
The burden today for government is to prove that shutting down social network sites will help the journalists during times of emergency to spread accurate news, and for the government to contain the problem that the emergency has created. What we're going to talk to you about today. First of all, let me define the motion. Social network sites means like Facebook. Emergency can be political or natural disaster, and yeah, that's basically our scope. My first point is about the difference between information and opinion, or the difference between social media and journalism. My second point is about the essential harms that it causes when you confuse the two. So first of all, I want to make our stance clear. Social media is not journalism, and what goes on social media is your opinion, and that opinion is not information. And why I'm pointing this out to you is because during and in times of emergency, you cannot afford to confuse the two, in the sense that you cannot afford to spread information because things are sensitive. There's a problem that is actively causing even more serious problems, such as violence. Perhaps it started out as just a contained, peaceful protest, but it escalates into something more violent. So in this situation, we do not need the banter of every and compare, for example, the reports that the sources of information, and this is verified papers, whereas willy-nilly contain the problem. Why is that inherent? It's too many sources of information. 100,000 sources, you cannot actually filter out which is best, but yet governments still have to react to them because apparently social media takes so much importance in the mindsets of people. But in an emergency, we can't deal with this sensitivity. We need a natural filter, because when you shut down these easy means of communications that social media sites are, these very accessible to any Tom, Dick, and Harry. When you shut down those easy accesses, what you're left is that people that are actually, for example, if you shut down social media, how would you report the news? You can use a satellite phone like they do in Egypt. That's when real journalists who have these satellites can actually spread accurate and valuable information, and every humdrum Abdullah in the country isn't going to start spreading violence. So number two, what is the situation during an emergency? During an emergency, people are people are inherently irrational. We saw after the Ferguson, Missouri shooting that because of the this was literally a police violence case, fair enough, and it does require some attention to white versus black relations in America. However, what we saw was the social media blew it up and exaggerated to a point where protests and copycat incidences occurred, propensity for violence. You see, you see copycat incidents happening in other cities, and you see people getting outraged over what essentially is a situation that city needed to take care of by itself, and not with the interference of 100,000 different voices who may or may not have the full information, who may not be looking at this appropriately. Before I go on.
Yeah, so why is it a country of emergency when political representation, especially for dissenting voices, is so important? Why is it important to have less information and not more?
Because you need, first of all, we're not against information at all. We're saying during an emergency, it's important to have accurate information. And I'll talk actually about how that polarization is bad. Because the second thing I want to say is like, okay, yeah, we understand that shutting down social networks is in essence restriction of information. So yeah, it is an infringement of a certain right, but this is a trade-off we are willing to take. You can say like, oh, well, corrupt dictators are just going to use this time happens in order to, like he said, silence dissent. First of all, that's a systematic problem. If you don't like your government, you can change your government, and maybe they wouldn't do it. But why is it justified? Is because they would have done that stuff anyway if they wanted to censor. They could just not an emergency time censor information. So we're talking about why is it important actually for the government itself, not just your evil dictator, but how there's a problem in the country that the state must face. How it's necessary to shut down social media. We can take an example like the Egyptian revolution. You know, everyone says, oh yeah, the social media is the reason why Hosni Mubarak got out of power. Well, first of all, social media only started the movement for this protest. But actually, the point it was shut down was when it became dangerous. When people started rioting in Tehran Square, women were being sexually assaulted, people are getting killed. And why? Because every faction in all these scenarios are all spreading violent rhetoric. And this actually polarizes because what? Look, do you see who the people that support Hosni Mubarak? There's certain various tribes, certain various army generals. They, even if they wanted to dissent, they couldn't, because social media was so vehemently against them that they will already be stigmatized, and that's why they had to support Hosni Mubarak. There was already this this whole wave against them. Yes.
If it's so dangerous that it might create panic and people may be harmed, why only limiting your model to states to the state of emergency as compared to all incident, in general?
Because we believe that people in general are rational, but during times of emergency, that's when they become irrational, because that's when things are getting to a point where life and death is at stake. It is not just your everyday humdrum issue. It is actually a situation that is escalated. It is not just a singular a problem. It is exacerbated. And these problems will continue to get exacerbated as long as social media exists to exacerbate them, because people are spreading not information, but misinformation and opinions, because there's no check and balance to social media. So if you can give me a proper check and balance, because not every journalist can sit there and stay up all night and see what everyone's saying on Facebook and then completely summarize it every day and verify the facts that are being presented that everyone put up. It's impossible. It's impractical. And during an emergency, it's especially important that they do so, because this information is very important, A, for journalists to spread awareness properly, and also for the government to contain the problems. Because, for example, if you get 1,000 reports from the police from various social media outlets, the police doesn't know where it's supposed to go during a times of emergency to solve a particular individual issue that's going on in this bigger emergency. However, when you have the alternative is you shut down this big source of information, and you just allow only the avenues of particularly good information to come in, and that is when government can contain its problem. That's when journalists' opinions aren't diluted by this overwhelming opinions of the social media, and that's when we can actually spread information rather than merely opinions during this sensitive time. So the main thing I wanted to get out of our speech is that people are inherently irrational during an emergency, and it's especially important during this time to have accurate and credible information. And with that, I proudly propose.
Right, thank you, Prime Minister. Now invite the leader of all to flash. Good.
A declaration of emergency is an abusive tool of the government to shut down political representation and disable the empowerment of the people during a fragile political turbulence. We think the exact remedy that society needs during times of emergency is more information and not government censorship. And let's be very clear about what we're okay with and what we're not okay with. Two things to look at. Number one, we think declaring emergency per se is okay, but we are not okay with certain corresponding rights given to the government once they declare an emergency. We think those powers that are associated with that declaration is what renders the right to declare an emergency becoming an abusive tool of the government. If we don't give them those powers, they will not abuse the right to declare an emergency. But secondly, we are okay with the government enforcing social order during times of emergency, but we're not okay with certain means of doing it. We're okay with you guys having curfews, having more patrolling, having active government reporting, but we're we're not okay with means that severely curbs the political empowerment of the people. So no, we're not okay with government shutting down information coming directly from the people, but we can have government reporting and citizen reporting coming hand in hand. Take a seat. We think the stance coming from OO is that times of national emergency are golden opportunities for political empowerment, and the people cannot be oppressed during those golden times. Before I move on to my three argumentation, two main rebuttals. Number one, the characterization of social media from opening government is unacceptable. They just say these are just a bunch of random opinions, they're all unverified, and all we want to do is cause the spread of violence. We think that's blatantly untrue, especially in the context of an emergency. Let's look at two things. Number one, we think in an emergency where information is scarce and that information directly impacts your safety as an individual, we think there's like that sense of responsibility for truthful reporting, especially in the age of Gen Y, where people are highly critical of certain information. We think what will happen is you create an active check and balance to force you to divulge what is the source of information and force other people within those same locations to then verify those information. They already do this towards regular established media by forcing them to verify whether the information is real. We think they will do that into a higher level if some random Jew is making a post about the sense of security in certain places. We think those criticisms will then make it a far more effective means of communication, because when people view the post, they'll have to view it in correspondence of the entire comments associated to those posts as well. But the second response, the second level to this, we think citizen reporting is far more efficient than conventional journalism under your method. Because A, if you see that there's riots and safety risk everywhere, the participation of conventional journalism is much more limited than the entirety of society who are directly compromised by certain locations under those situations. These are actual victims on the ground telling people that here are the situations that are happening, and then this is immediately verified by large group of people, versus the kind of processing that requires under your model where it has to go several editors, means, and then only you can report the situations. Instantaneous reporting is what you require if your concern is social order. Let's look at the second rebuttal, the idea of retaining social order, and that was their prerogative. We have two responses. Number one, they're debating as if this is the only way to ensure social order. List of alternatives as to how we can achieve far more effective. Things like more patrolling and actual curfews to limit the movements of suspicious individuals are actual tangible things to ensure security, versus your intangible perception of maybe there's a security risk going on. It's not even exclusive. And the harms that you wanted to point out are not exclusive either. Any kinds of reporting can generate panic. Any kinds of reporting can make you feel slightly unsafe. We don't see why this is an exclusive harm to social media that you only have to shut them down. But the second response is this. We think you compromise social order in the absence of information, because you will create worse panic, like in the times of Boston bombings, like they said, when we don't have information, people are quick to make assumptions because they require these answers. What happens when you shut down social media is that information is forced to go underground so that the government doesn't shut down those information channels, so the government doesn't have an avenue to provide a counter information because they cannot find out that this information exists. That's when worse social reactions happen, because people presume and there's no check and balance as to whether or not this information is real, because they're away from government supervisory bodies. Three argumentation from my speech. Firstly, why this is the most constructive means for political empowerment of the people. Secondly, why social order is better achieved when you have social media. And thirdly, we increase the accountability of governments when you allow scrutiny of the international community. Before that, any POIs. Perfect. Constructive means of political empowerment on two levels. Number one, we think national emergencies are symptomatic of failing governments. We think 9 out of 10 times, the reason why we have nationwide panic is because that kind of fragility of the social climate is caused by a failing government needs. So you look at all the situations, Occupy Center riots in Hong Kong, liberation movement in Venezuela, in Egypt, ethnic riots in Turkey. All of these seem like this. Number one, an immense criticism of the working government that led to those social riots, social movements. And number two, the government's inevitably shutting down societal social network sites to prolong their reign of power until that political traction is lost in the future. All of them use these opportunities to declare emergency, to shut down information by the people. So the second level, why is this a time-sensitive issue and information has to be out right now during times of emergency? We have two reasons. Number one, the ability to organize a political reform is contingent on holistic participation of society. That's the only way you can create sufficient pressure on the government state to make significant concessions. We think mainstream media and those kinds of governments are always owned and controlled by the state. That's why we need people-centric reporting that are far more truthful in the actual events on the ground. We think the absence of which we have social media sites. What we then have is only community centralized reaction. So we only have sporadic organizations, because that's as far as the word of mouth can go. We can only have one small community writing rather than entire community writing. So the second level to this, it is only with this massive holistic participation you can create the kind of awareness from other people to be introspective about their political stances. Because what government can do when they control the media and the social networking sites, they can misrepresent the gravity of those rights by saying that's only a minority of people, and of course it doesn't represent the huge political dissatisfaction of the entirety of society. We think in this instance as well, the Gen Y age were desensitized to mainstream media because there are a lot of criticisms. They always access social media sites, articles that go viral. Those are the things that generate the kind of attention coming from Gen Y generations, and they're particularly important to participate in political empowerment. All right, why social order is better? We think the right to self-defense is contingent on the ability to disseminate and access information, because these are people who are directly affected on the ground. The most effective means of mobilizing society and protection of the current victims of circumstances is when you have social media sites. The exclusive trait to it is a single post can reach 1,000 friends, all of which have the ability to contact the police, versus one single phone call in an extremely restricting circumstances. You have to go through several mediums. So this is elaborate process versus everyone coming together to help and protect these individuals and informing other people that there are safety hazards within those areas and you should go and protect yourself. It's far better, Mr. Speaker, when this information is out in the open and information doesn't go underground, therefore panic is not caused. Argument of accountability coming in Shafiq's speech. For all of these reasons, political empowerment can only be achieved when you allow social media sites to be out in the open, without which you are a government that oppresses your people. We're very proud to oppose.
Right? We thank the opposition.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's understand something about emergencies, right? We're not talking about doomsday. We're not saying the Kiyama is here and all of us need to run and take a boat. That's not the scenario we're talking about. We're talking about the emergencies that are actually commonplace, right? So, for example, Ferguson, Missouri. We're talking about emergencies that take place in financially affected countries, like, for example, Greece. When Greece was about to go bankrupt, people went to ATM machines and just started banging those things up, right? So the government had to essentially shut down social media so people do not become violent in an organized manner, because people are inherently irrational. That's the whole thing that we told you, and we drew parallels and told you why that's the case. On the other hand, my comes up and tells you, whenever there is something going wrong and whenever there's an emergency, that's the exact moment you need to run and probably hide in some sort of bunker to be safe. But we don't think that's what the availability heuristic dictate. That's not the case in vast majority of the cases, right? Therefore, that's the problem. It's more about a conflict, usually between certain sects of people, and that's when one or the other sect is prone to violence, one or the other sect is prone to hating each other and just attacking on each other. What happened in Ferguson, right? So black people just went down to the street and started bashing on every white person's house, every white person's store. People who actually used to be friends, because they said, hey, you know what? Police are beating up black people in mass. But that was simply not the case. There was no checks and balance. She talks about how people are informed and read all those comments and rationalize. That's simply not the case whenever there's an emergency. Therefore, we call it an emergency, because you simply do not care what people who dissent in terms of your opinion say. You only care about the people you know. You only care about your own people. You only care about the stakeholders who face similar problems to you. And that sort of polarization only information, how it's stifling all possibilities of. She's going to end holistic reporting in whole, right? But we're not talking about a government that has suddenly imposed all limits to freedom of information. We're only talking about a limited amount of time where people become irrational. So we tell you, for that limited amount of time, we need to limit their source of information which can harm them and harm their community, because they're essentially irrational. Therefore, we tell you all the things that they want, constructive discussion and so on, can still take place after the emergency. They still take place even before the emergency. We don't think the problem in Ferguson, Missouri has been there the day the emergency took place. Right? It has been there for ages. It has been in other cities for ages. Discussions took place before and after that. But the only thing that happened in Ferguson, Missouri is violence, and that is something we do not condone. But that's the usual thing that takes place. Greek government has been screwing up for ages, and people have been talking about it for ages. But the moment they went on to the banks and rampaged all the banks in Greece, it did not help their cause. It only deteriorated the status that banks have in their country, and it only harmed business in general. So we tell you, people are inherently irrational, and they have simply failed to identify the real scenario. Therefore, we tell you the whole idea about government shutting down discussion is simply not true. Government shutting down organized reform is simply not true, because organized reform doesn't take place through that small window of time of emergency, or takes place after that. Organized reform takes place from the day the problem arises, right? Therefore, their characterization is flawed and untrue to begin with. Yes.
You never told us why people become irrational only for a short time. But if they are, wouldn't that kind of panic and violence be worse if information is pushed underground and there's no check and balance to verify?
Well, first we have told you, right, when people are harmed, that's when people lean towards the side that is more polarized, right? So there is polarization, and people tend to go towards side that they inherently support, and that's exactly what propagates the violence. But that's when you are enabling them, and that's when we're disabling them. However, the moment the emergency ends, they still go on to have those discussions, right? So they still go on to have those discussions, and we can still have all those. So they haven't told us why all those things do not take place in our scenario. All those do take place in our scenario in a more constructive manner, without that destructive phase that precedes it, right? And that's the phase that we're aiming to shut down. Now, moving on, when they talk about the whole phase of information, let's look at how information is verified under emergencies. It's not verified. You just go into Facebook, you say your friend something, you see your friend said something, and you believe it, right? And that's exactly what happens. We see all the time two football teams going up against each other. One team won, another team lost. Some people start claiming, oh, there was cheating, and then suddenly a bunch of people come up and start trashing cities. This is commonplace, and this is what happens. This is what happens when people get into the mob mentality. They simply do not rationalize things, and that's the scenario that we're dealing. And that's the scenario that we're dealing with. However, their method of dealing with these scenarios is imposing curfews, gassing people, and patrolling. But we tell you, those things simply do not work. Right? Those things simply do not work when there's a mob against you, right? So the mob is essentially and always bigger than the number of people who are trying to prevent, i.e. the law enforcement. And therefore, the mob is usually in most of these cases successful. And that's why you simply cannot depend on preventing. You have to preempt the problem, and you also have to remember this emergency time frame is always a very short time frame, and the moment this time frame is over, you can always deal with the inherent issues. But they haven't told us why we need to accept the harm to deal with the inherent issues. We can do them under both paradigms, right? Now moving on, the other issues that came within this debate, and that they pretty much confused. Firstly, what is the scope of emergency, right? As I have already made it clear, it's not a daily thing. It's not something you see every day waking up in the morning. It's something that happens once in a while in isolated places, and it's something that happens for a short amount of time. We haven't seen emergencies exceeding weeks. That usually doesn't happen. Therefore, all their arguments do not fit within the sense of reality that we know. I don't know what world they're talking about, probably some dystopian world. But secondly, we have also told you how these cases like racism are always under discussion. They don't depend on people posting violent and fiery comments when they are pissed, right? They don't depend on people calling people to arms. That's not what the discussion for racism depends on. And that's the bad kind of discussion that we saw taking place in Ferguson, Missouri, right? That's the bad kind of discussion, and we don't want that. We want the constructive kind of discussion that doesn't rely on people harming and hating each other. However, they're enabling the same groups of people who are always waiting to harm each other. However, the third issue that we hear is, when is it that people are irrational? People do become irrational when they feel harmed. And that's when people go back to their comfort zone. They go back to people they know. And that's where they go back and reside within their own feedback mechanisms, their closed loop of information. And that's exactly the moment when people become irrational, as we have seen from what happened in the real world. Therefore, let's get back to the real world and admit during times of emergency, you cannot depend on people being rational. That simply isn't the case. We need to preempt the problem and not prevent it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Prime Minister. Close the opening round by the leader of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the reason why opening opposition will win this debate is because we are going to concede the harm. We're going to say that maybe in some situations, panic and violence might take place. But we're going to say, even with that harm, the benefits, if you juxtapose it to the benefits that we bring forward, we are willing to take that risk. We're willing to sacrifice the harms that they talked about. So firstly, let's deal with the two biggest things that came from opening government. They had a problem with unverified and false information. We have 4 responses to this. Firstly, we don't think most often than not, people are not unreasonable or dumb to make a decision or commit to an action based on one tweet or one Facebook post. Most often than not, when you're talking about the state of emergency, when someone is about to make a radical decision or an action, ladies and gentlemen, most often than not, they will base their decision based on overwhelming information that are coming from citizens on the ground. So if I am in Hong Kong and I see one tweet that says that, maybe some violence is happening, I would probably want to look for more information, ladies and gentlemen, on the issue before I make a decision to move or to, report to the authorities and things like that. So we think, on the balance, we think that people are more reasonable. People would try to find out from more sources, ladies and gentlemen, before they make that decision. But secondly, we think it is important for this information to be on social media. Why is this so? Because most often than not, this information is a trigger for more investigation to be done on that particular issue. So most often than not, a citizen journalist will tweet something and media corporation and government will use that information as a first step to go on the scene, to learn more about the information and to spread it to the public. So we think that is fundamentally important as a value. But secondly, we think that all this unverified or false information are most often than not exceptions rather than a rule, because we think that in most situations, a citizen will have a natural incentive not to spread false information or to create panic because it is counterproductive to their own interest for self-preservation. If a country is not stable, it's not good for them, ladies and gentlemen. Most often than not, in times of emergency, citizens give information to help and to protect others. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that if that's the case, if they are so worried about panic, and you heard the examples that came from opening government about the situation in Ferguson, which wasn't a state of emergency, which is tweeting about a football match and claiming that it's cheating, which is not a state of emergency, we think that they are principally inconsistent, because if they are so afraid with misinformation, then they should ban it altogether, because the risk that they're talking about can happen even outside of a state of emergency, ladies and gentlemen. So we think opening government has not been principally consistent in telling us why it should be done in the state of emergency when their examples were not consistent with that.
In a state of emergency, where the people have decided that the government has failed and no longer rely on the government, they turn to social media for falsified information. Wouldn't you like that make it worse?
No, because we think the way in which people view information on social media and the way in which people report are if the information is true, most often than not, the reporting will be overwhelming. There will be a lot of people on the ground reporting the same thing. If there's one tweet versus an overwhelming tweet to say that what that guy is saying is wrong, we think it is more likely that the citizen or people will follow the overwhelming message that is sent to the society. Secondly, irrationality. We think it is at best an assertion. We don't believe that people are irrational. We think that people, most often than not, during the time of emergency, are more rational, they are more vigilant, and they make more calculated decisions, ladies and gentlemen, because their lives is at stake. They won't base an important decision or action that they will take based on one tweet. Secondly, even if they're irrational,
in terms of understanding the message that has been sent on social media, we don't think people will act in an irrational manner. Yes, the message may be irrational. It might call for people to do irrational things, but we think people are more likely to assess and make judgments and not do irrational things because there are laws to say that if you do violent things, you will be put in prison. Most often than not, people are law-abiding. And if you want to talk about the exceptions, which are mobs and stuff like that, we can't stop them anyway, ladies and gentlemen. That will happen anyway. Lastly, we think that it is worse if the information goes underground. I told you that it is, at least in the open, there can be counter narratives to show whether or not that thing is true or not. And we think that is important. If it goes underground, when a small group is propagating false information based on word of mouth, we don't think the truth will be able to compete with this false information, ladies and gentlemen. And that creates more harm than what we are supporting under the status quo. But lastly, we think that if you are afraid of X, irrational acts will happen anyway, despite the source. So if, let's say, a news company reports something, the reaction, the irrational reaction that you are talking about by the mob will happen anyway, ladies and gentlemen, despite the source. So if you are afraid of that, then you should ban reporting in general, ladies and gentlemen, because you're so afraid on how people might interpret this information and react. What is the alternative that they supported? They supported verified information coming from news companies and governments. The problem with that is, during the time of emergency or natural disasters, for example, it is time sensitive. I have the right to self-defense. I want to tell people to save me. I want to tell my family members that Hurricane Katrina is coming because I can see it, ladies and gentlemen. I think it is important, and it is important for people to post these pictures and post these videos to let people know that it is important. But secondly, we can't rely on news corporation because they are also vulnerable to being captured by the state. Fox being pro-Republican, don't let me start with RTM and TV3, ladies and gentlemen. But most importantly, news corporations always try to play safe because they are vulnerable to legal action, for example. So they are often not reporting the truth. They will withhold information until they're absolutely sure when people are harmed, when it's time sensitive. Let's look at why this is important. We think that it galvanizes support, allows people to galvanize support, and also pressure governments. We think that social media has been fundamentally crucial in telling the international community of what's happening in your country, ladies and gentlemen. That is why we sent a lot of support, or we had open condemnation of Bashar, because the information was coming from the people. You can't rely on Al Dunya, which is a state-owned corporation in Syria, ladies and gentlemen, to tell the international community that people are using chemical weapons on the ground. The videos, the pictures that are sent created that pressure, and we think that is important. We also think it is important for social networking to report these things, especially in like natural disasters, for example, so that the pictures, the visceral reaction that people will have over seeing these messages and pictures and videos will allow people to send help, send aid, ladies and gentlemen, and that is fundamentally crucial for to ensure a better society. Thomas Jefferson once said, if you had a choice between a free government and free information, ladies and gentlemen, choose the latter because the latter promises the former.
Right, we thank the leading opposition. So for the closing out, we invite Member.
Now, I might not have a quote that's impressive as that, but I'm going to tell you why closing government is going to win this debate for multiple reasons. Right? We're going to tell you what's the more important stuff, the real tangible harms that exist when you allow social media, interpretations, misuse of information, and more importantly, rumors and threats that can be given by the enemy, everything that's important to maintain people in a side where they don't have to panic and make the government suffer. But let's look at one question I have to opening opposition. Is a national emergency the best filter to determine who deserves a right and what do we do in these circumstances? First response, we always limit the right to information to prevent panic with the individuals because we always understand there's an overwhelmingly beneficial outcome that you get. That's why we limit the right to information and we don't show things like the full horrors of war during times of war because people often get panicked and do things that are irrational to begin with. But secondly, most importantly, will people report the best form of information to begin with? No, because people aren't accountable to anything where the state is accountable to the people. So the state will try their very best interest to give out the most accurate and correct information to the people so that people understand the state is trying to do something that is helping me, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, we think people make assumptions and lies when it comes to reporting because they are not accountable to anything in the first place. No, thank you, Mike. The third thing that I want to talk about this is your model essentially allows people to pinpoint the blame on each other, and there is no social order. Your discourse that exists because of a social media exacerbates these harms and further splits the society into two parts. For example, someone who's against the government or someone who's for government. So a chaos that is not necessary during times of emergency, something that we have to prevent because we need social order in order to curb problems. But the fourth response is that this sparks unnecessary discourse that is driven by irrational minds who want to get away from problems as soon as possible. Thus, they reach conclusions that are stupid because they don't understand the situation. They're often irrational, they often think about themselves, and they often try their very best to avoid the nearest possible harm. That's why when they go to the internet and they search for solutions to their problems, they go to the nearest form of logic and believe in that because they believe that the state has failed to protect them, and that's why I have to go to the social media to protect myself and get information from the social media to make my lives better to begin with, Mr. Speaker. We think that these discussions are based on conclusions, but people often make decisions based on discussions on the internet. No, thank you. But number 5, will people tell the truth? Assuming that they do tell the truth and tell everyone about the situation within their location, people often spread information based on assumptions that can often lead to inaccurate spread of information that can harm a lot of individuals, Mr. Chair, because we understand. For example, if you see someone holding a gun in a dodgy place, you automatically assume that there's a terrorist and he's attacking your country. That doesn't always have to be true. There can be a spy for your own nation to begin with. You tell people that in these situations, this particular location in my country is being harmed. I have to protect myself. I tell people. Creates an unnecessary panic to a lot of individuals, and we don't want this necessary panic. But in times of a state of emergency, the state will try their very best to give out a lot of information, and most amounts of information so that people believe in them, and the state wants the people to be on their side. So if you have a problem, you go tell the state, and the state will tell the people, so we can decide whether that's a reliable source of information or not. Then only we can publish to the people. No, thank you. But let's move on to my 2 arguments that I have today. Why will social media hamper the ability for the state to take care of people? Firstly, we have to understand the government needs as much cooperation from the people. And we think that that's why they keep operations a secret from social acceptance, because often people's input on certain things will often hamper the ability for governments to do things that are in the best interest of people. That's why during the NSA, we hid certain information because we wanted to protect people like national security. But people never understood that. They started hating the government and they started telling that the government was breaching some individuals' rights to privacy. Although there's an ulterior benefit that is supremely beneficial, national security, Mr. Chair. But in these circumstances, there was harm because the government tells everyone, people find out what's going on. Firstly, when you have people necessarily under a good social situation, firstly, it allows governments to run the operations much smoothly. This means they don't have to worry about people getting involved in these circumstances. They can assign their soldiers or whatever they want to do in a much more smoother manner, and thus making it better. But secondly, we need people to feel safe so that we can take care of them better. If people are in a state of panic and they want to run away from their homes, which will make them suffer in the end of the day, we need states to not allow the information to be spread by the internet. But before I move on to my second piece of analysis, take any one of you.
Even information by the state and the media may cause panic. That's not an exclusive harm. But citizen reporting as a media for political reforms is a benefit exclusive to social networking.
Look, in these circumstances, the state will try their very best to disseminate information that will not lead to panic. But more often than not, we're going to tell you whether social media leads to even more unnecessary panic that we don't want to stand by, and we think that it creates an insight of fear. Why does the social media hamper the ability of the state to make things right? Number 1, Mr. Chair, there are rumors that could be spread because of certain assumptions that individuals make to make it better, because they seem that that's the best solution to something that they could potentially see happening, Mr. Chair. This information is given out to everyone who is on Facebook, who is on Twitter, who immediately believes it because they believe that the state has failed and this is the only method to gain any form of information. This firstly incites panic. But more often than not, this will also happen because a lot of individuals, like terrorists, for example, incite fear through the social media, and this is an enemy strategy to attack your own nation and make them panic in the first place. We don't want any more panic, we don't want any more fear, and we don't want any more pain. No, thank you. But secondly, they negatively react to the government because when they have discourse within society, in most times of national emergency, the conclusion that is reached is that the government has failed and we have to ignore the government and not cooperate with them. This is worse because the government is trying their very best to curb the problem, and in order for that to happen, we need cooperation from as much individuals as possible. But secondly, we want to prevent any threats that, for example, that's anyone who is opposing the state. For example, beheadings or official threats that are led by people who are trying to threaten your state, like terrorist groups or terrorist organizations that are purposely meant to incite fear into individuals, that disrupts the cooperation between people and the state. This makes it even easier for anyone to come and intervene into your country or anyone to incite any more pain into the people of your nation. No, thank you. And this is easily passed through social media. Firstly, it's harmful because it's already extreme amounts of panic to begin with. You couple that with even more panic in the first place. But secondly, most importantly, it's a state-sanctioned panic. The state is digging their own grave. They're allowing the social media to allow society who is firstly irrational, and here's why. If you're going to die and you don't see that the state is doing anything for you, at the end of the day, you will become irrational and try your very best to get out of that shithole. That's why you want your very best to go to the nearest conclusion in these circumstances. So when people are irrational, they make irrational decisions that affect their daily lives. For example, in social media, ISIS creates a lot of panic by posting beheadings. And that's why they are able to recruit a lot more people, because people essentially believe that ISIS is stronger than any other government out there, because the ISIS is able to do these many things and create this amount of panic, and that fear motivates them to become stronger and stronger. If you want to prevent any forms of political tension or any forms of things happening during a national emergency, you need the government to ensure that the people are kept in check and they are in calm situations. If you want that to happen, you cannot disseminate unnecessary, false threats or even rumors in the social media that could affect the daily lives of individuals. If everyone panics and no one is kept in check, that could jeopardize missions that governments has for most people, and could jeopardize how the government has planned for the national emergency. We are very proud to propose.
I can thank the member of staff. I invite Member Hall.
So Speaker, we will win this debate because this isn't just about the good or bad of social media during times of emergencies like what we've heard so far. The motion specifically calls for a government action in shutting it down. What we will do exclusively from Closing Opposition is to show you why it is legitimate for governments to keep these social medias open and free and fair to the public when there's inherent good, and why it benefits these governments at the end of the day, especially in times of emergencies. I will do 4 things for you. 1, why we have the right to allow people to protect themselves from these kinds of situations, and why it's an innate right for governments to do that, especially when they've lost the moral legitimacy in those times of emergencies. Secondly, why the digital empowerment of individuals on the ground becomes far higher in terms of a governmental priority than conforming to the kinds of norms during those emergencies. Thirdly, how should governments then react in times of emergencies in order to get the kind of international backing, whether it's political or economical, in order for it to get out of those times of emergencies? And lastly, why it is an essential tool for communication at the end of the day. Firstly, 3 rebuttals. They talk about the accuracy of this information, and therefore they have a problem with the spread of the accuracy of this information. It might be lies and it might be false. But they never concluded the moral juxtaposed to that, which would be the absence of this information in totality. What we're willing to side on throughout the bench is to tell you that in the event of falsehood or lies occurring, it far outweighs, it is overweighed by the fact that we will get more information at the end of the day as opposed to the absence of it. Secondly, they tell us you hamper the ability for good decisions at the end of the day. That assumes that governments still have the moral legitimacy in the eyes of the people in times of those emergencies. We think that moral legitimacy doesn't stand. So even if it debilitates governments, we think it's fine. Lastly, they told us that there's an external incitement of pain and panic in these kinds of things, and therefore we shouldn't cause this. But what you're really worried about isn't false information, because factual errors we can correct. It's self-regulating. You're worried about expressions and opinions. What we would question is the moral legitimacy to muzzle out expressions that might cause panic, because you never proved to us that it might cause panic, but it doesn't mean it's any more less legitimate as an expression or as an opinion to begin with. So we think that's the debate. So why should governments in times of emergencies not shut down social media? Because the right for people to protect themselves is naturally inherent, especially when governments have lost their legitimacy. 1, we think states have lost their legitimacy as legal custodians because they've already conceded that this is a state failure which led to those kinds of emergencies in the first place. Secondly, you allow governments now, under their model, to muzzle out differing opinions when everyone in this debate agreed that governments must act in the most responsible way in those times of emergencies, considering the times of emergencies are a result of differing opinions, political or otherwise. Thirdly, the right for people to protect their masks, because the causation of that emergency involves that kind of state failure. That means there's some moral culpability as far as the state is concerned when they can't act as that neutral balance, and they can't be the sound of reason when they are part of that reason of that emergency to begin with. As a result, each person becomes his or her own agent in that time of emergency, and therefore the responsibility of protection is on those individuals. That is why it's perfectly legitimate for governments to allow those social media sites to exist, because it is a form of protection when people can communicate and spread the kind of information because they're an agent of their own individuals. Secondly, why is the digital empowerment of individuals on the ground far more important than societal pressures to just conform? One, we think the more information that's out there, even if it's not in its most accurate form, gives people the choice of patronage. Understanding why unfettered information, especially when governments and media can't be trusted, is important. One, this is a self-regulating mechanism. We've heard that from opening opposition. But the two more key important points here. People need to be able to pick their patronage because of the differentiation in opinions that exist that has caused these kinds of emergencies. Secondly, polarization is, especially when we have agreed to disagree on these kinds of issues that have been the cause of those kinds of emergencies. The information that is out there leads to the ability for people to have that paradox of choice in order to pick the kind of patronages that they want to align. Thirdly, there is no neutral regulator in times of emergencies because states have to pick a side. The media will never be unbiased in these situations, and therefore people must have the information at its plethora in order for them to pick the kind of lineages and patronages that they want to subscribe to. That's why it's very important. Why should states void themselves of this? We've already explained to you that each individual in times of emergency then becomes his or her agent. But there's a huge societal pressure then to conform, because what they do then is to muzzle out the right for people to dissent and to use social media sites as an ability to dissent from the kind of emergencies that they exist under. Thirdly, why should governments do this in order to gain the international backing from, which is very, very important? Sit down. One, we think international support and backing is highly important, and you only attain that by two things. One, you show the differentiation in opinions and the allowance for the differentiation of opinions to exist. But secondly, you show the international community that you've been able to solve your emergencies through quandary settlements by using the proper political tools and not muzzling out dissenting voices, using the kind of social media sites by labeling it false and lies. Not yet. Shutting it down means one of two things. Either there's an oppression of expressions that are there, or B, you as a state or as a responsible state to begin with, has been a catalyst of that kind of propaganda to begin with, and you further exacerbate the propagandas that are there opening.
So during this time of tribal polarization, what incentive do people have to be true or critical?
They can be critical because there's a lineage or patronage that they have to align themselves to when it comes to the differentiation of opinions. So we think polarization is a good thing. The reason why this is fundamentally important is because to get out of those kinds of emergencies, states need to be dependent upon the international community, either economically or for peacekeeping efforts and so on and so forth. It is fundamentally important for governments then to be able to do this. But lastly, it is a tool for communication. Conventional emergencies become far more easier to penetrate and gain, especially when you're dealing with things like natural disasters or anarchy risk groups. These are the types of social media conventions that are far more important because you're able to then communicate on far more different private platforms to begin with. These are the fundamental reasons of why governments need to allow not just the benefits or the harms of why social media need to be there. There are fundamental differences when it comes to times of emergencies when they're differentiating opinions and people need to choose their allegiances and need to choose their political alliances with. And this is why, Mr. Speaker, the government should not do this. Proper oppose.
Right, we thank them all. Last speaker we got on the bench.
Mr. Speaker, we've all concluded that under all premises, the government has failed. The question then becomes, how do we deal with the situation? How do we try to leave the state of emergency? We don't think, at best, right, we don't think it's fun to prioritize international backing or international reputation when it comes to a national emergency. It's a priority to leave the national emergency as fast as possible. It's a priority to cater to around individuals who are suffering from racism, individuals who are suffering from violence under most circumstances. So at best, Ms. Speaker, if you want to get international backing, we think it should be post-emergency, and those priorities should come after, right? So we don't think under most circumstances, it's a trade-off. Under our paradigm, we shut down media sites, sure, we do look bastardous in the international community, but the trade-off is we get more cooperation from people on the ground. We get people who are less, people who are more obedient, people who cooperate with government evacuation under most circumstances, people who don't question government authority. Sure, the government has messed up, but they're trying to fix the situation, and we don't think violence and spreading hatred through social media is any better. But I'm going to do three things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to respond to closing opposition. Secondly, I'm going to look at the two extensions that came out. I'm going to look at the three opening opposition. First, no thank you. First, closing opposition. Let's look at the first extension, right? Firstly, they try to tell us that individuals should be given the ability to protect themselves, because governments need to act in the most responsible way, and protecting individuals is giving individuals opportunity to protect themselves is the best thing to do there. Firstly, this is premised on individuals feeling insecure, and it's something we don't want to instigate within individuals in the first place, because when you allow social media sites to continue, you allow individuals to feel insecure, to feel like states cannot take care of them and states can't fix the situation. That is when this argument is harmful, because making it a priority to protect yourself in times of a national emergency creates that distrust within the government, creates the distrust that we don't want to happen. We want states and law enforcers to be there to handle emergencies, not people who take the law into their own hands, not people who feel like they can fix the situation, but not, right? We think that states should be the ones who are taking the initiative to protect individuals on the ground. States, you have to follow a certain procedure. That's why even though individuals might be delayed in terms of protecting themselves, it's still a worthy trade-off, because states have the ability to fix the situation. These emergencies are time sensitive. States have the ability to come up with the best alternatives. We don't think protecting yourself is a major priority when states are already making these plans to get you out. No, thank you. Secondly, digital improvement. He talked about how there's no neutral regulation when it comes to a certain discourse on social media, right? People should be able to pick a side and pick their own ideologies as to what they want to believe is right and wrong. We think that this is especially harmful in times of an international emergency, when you split society into two, one that sides with the government and one that believes the government was the one that should not exist in the first place. We think that this is especially harmful in times of a national emergency, because we don't want more panic to happen. We don't want more riots to happen, Mr. Speaker. This is a time-sensitive issue. We need to get out of it in a faster way. And creating your own stances when it comes to social media, or creating your own platforms on social media itself, is extremely harmful, because we want this situation to end as soon as possible and hampering this. After my responses. Thirdly, let's look at international backing. I've already dealt with this largely, right? We think it's not a priority under these circumstances. We think making people feel safe is the major priority. If international backing or international actors are going to look to anything, they're going to look to the fact that you were able to keep your country calm in a time of emergency, even if you caused that emergency to begin with. So sure, these countries' reputation are tarnished, but the ability for them to keep their people in a state of in a state of security, or the ability for them to make the people feel secure, the ability to leave that emergency as soon as possible, is what will gain the most amount of international backing. And post-emergency is what we think international backing is all about. Yes, opening.
Your only harm of panic can be mitigated by so many alternative means. But citizen reporting has no alternative of equal significance. So even if you can see panic, can you just weigh the trade-off here?
Yeah, we are weighing the trade-off, right? We think panic is something extremely harmful. Sure, we do have legitimate forms of media under our paradigm. We have government-facilitated media that is given out to more individuals. And we think that it's in times of emergency, governments have more of a reason to be accountable towards the people, because they've already messed up. They have so many things more to lose, right? That means they have more of a reason to be more legitimate during times of emergency, to provide legitimate forms of information towards the people. That is our alternative. That is how we are going to fix this time of a national emergency. We don't think social media is going to help the situation any more than it is by inciting panic. Let's compare national media and social media, right? Even though they provide the same thing and they are interpreted in the same way by different groups of individuals, national media is a reason to keep people in a secure way, compared to social media, where they continuously post things that could instigate violence, that could instigate negative reaction from society, compared to governments or government-facilitated programs that have a reason to give the people something to be secure about, have a reason to keep people in a secure state. That's the difference that we we want to keep clear. That is why we think the national media is more secure, even if it was the reason why this is national emergency. No, thank you. What are the two extensions that we brought you? Firstly, we talked about why social media hampers the ability for state to handle the situation. Because in times of a national emergency, states need the most amount of cooperation. Whether it being a terrorist attack, whether it being evacuation for a tornado, we think states need the ability to be able to cooperate with the people to handle the situation in a much better manner, to handle the situation. All the operations that the states can carry out to cater towards the individuals is much better facilitated when you don't have mediums of posing hatred towards the state, mediums of criticizing the state for putting these individuals in the state of national emergency. We think that sure, the state might have caused the national emergency, but them trying to get out of that situation is something to recognize. National media makes it impossible to forget that the state causes emergency. It makes it impossible for the state to move on because it always allows you to facilitate that same amount of hatred towards the state. Secondly, we talked about how it hampers the change that we can make, right? Because rumors and opinions that people produce, even though they might be true to some extent, that panic that is still instigated by the true rumor or by the true opinion is still extremely harmful. We think that states have a better job of deciphering this information towards the people, in making the people not panic. Second extension, yeah, we don't know how people will act in harmful ways, right? The moment they see this information, we cause more violence, you cause more vigilantism, because there's a lack of distrust from the people in itself. We think that this links to their argument about people feeling safe. When does the border stand? Because under your paradigm, you force people, or you give people the opportunity to protect themselves. These are people have a general distrust towards the government. This is why people take matters into their own hands and try to protect themselves. Let's look at opening opposition, right? Because opening opposition had two arguments. So firstly, political empowerment of the people. They talk about immense criticisms of the government, how the government was the main reason of being in this. Sure, the very reason that the national emergency already existed is the fact that the government put them there. But we need to move past that, Mr. Speaker. We need to try to fix the situation. So we don't think empowerment of the people's opinions in trying to oppress the government or the people's opinions against the government is the best thing at the current moment. The second argument was social order and trying to include and help people protect themselves. Like I said, it's not a priority at the moment, right? Governments already try to handle the situation by increasing patrols, by increasing law enforcers in trying to help the situation. So we think we can already mitigate the harms that already exist, Mr. Speaker. The national emergency might have been caused by the government, but the government is trying to fix it, and we need as much cooperation with the people as possible. That cannot exist in a free medium where everybody can give all their opinions and all their own expressions of how the situation happened.
Right, we thank Rafiq. Now the last piece of debate, opposition. Okay.
We think it's oxymoronic that this side of the house choose to believe that trust can be fostered in really bleak times, ladies and gentlemen, by bleeping out any form of major source of communication in today's world. We think that this side of the house would stand particularly for that reason. But let's look at what we did in this debate. The perspective of opening opposition was from a perspective of why people need social media, especially in times of perspective. But in closing, we talked to you specifically about why the state has an interest to allow social media, especially in times of emergency. And we think that especially when you look from the state's perspective, it's the only determining factor as to whether or not this will really happen in this debate. Now I'll look in terms of things extension, and then I'll look at two questions in this debate: the validity of banning social media in times of emergency, and secondly, how do we ensure unity as well in that very time of emergency? Now, Tim gave you 4 arguments when he talked to you about how the state gives the right to protect themselves, digital empowerment, and why it needs to be unfettered. The third one would be international backing, and the fourth one, tools of communication. He extensively talked to you about the state's failure to maintain a functioning unit, something that was considered as well by this side of the house. When they looked at Greece's economic collapse, the wars and civil disobedience that already existed, something that everyone recognizes to be a failure in the state to maintain a functioning unit that already exists. Now, the trade-off between individuals and their rights with the state always exists because the state has maintained that symbiotic relationship where you provide individuals with the functioning requirements for them to survive in the country. The failure to do so also means that the state as a functioning body has already failed to maintain that very structure. That legitimizes, ladies and gentlemen, the need for people to start protecting themselves when the states have already failed to do so, when they're waging wars, or when they're unable to keep the country safe, or when they're unable able to maintain the sort of national security that exists. This justifies the need for people to protect themselves. But secondly, he also talked to you about the empowerment of individuals, especially in these times. Because if you want to look at how status quo exists, you have to feel trained in order for you to write any form of journalism, or to be a journalist, or to write, or to be pretty enough to stand in front of TV and report an issue. But we tell you that social media allows individuals the ability to empower themselves, because you don't need skills, you don't even need to spell correctly in order for you to update your status that already exists. Especially when times are bleak, ladies and gentlemen, this sort of empowerment, this sort of ability allows you to empower yourself and gives you hope, especially when everything else or your surrounding is collapsing behind you. This sort of virtual reality also allows you to abstain from the environment that you're in. If your environment is full with distrust and hate and fear, this allows you an escape, ladies and gentlemen, for you to feel empowered and for you to take control of your life, particularly at this form of call it guerrilla journalism, if you would like. But also, they talked about this international backing, and we tell you it's more important for states to maintain their image, especially in these times, to show themselves to be progressive, in order for you to get international backing, because you risk looking like a despot if you try to limit or you try to restrict any form of freedom for your society. But let's look at the two questions now. Firstly, the validity of banning social media in times of emergency. The only answers that this side of the house have is that it's rational, it's irrational, it's panic-stricken, it will cause violence, and you have inaccurate information. The question is really this: the spread of information in times of distress is never contingent on social media and social media alone. Even if you look at the Hutus and the Tutsis in Congo, ladies and gentlemen, they were able to mobilize mass amounts of group massacres even without social media, and we tell you it's invalid for you to solely blame social media, because if you want to do so, it exists. But secondly, we think it's more important because in a society where it's so insulated and your community around you is just spreading hate and distrust, you're more inclined to act within the environment or the confines of the environment. We tell you social media provides you a counter view that's broader and that's away, that steps you from the bigger picture, away from the sort of distress that you're currently in and the social pressures that you may face. We tell you that this need for a broader view helps with society to help promote some form of rational view, and not for you to fall within the sort of panic and distress as your environment. But then they say, the question then that they brought up was, do governments lie or do people lie? But in times of emergency, ladies and gentlemen, the call to ban this comes from a call from a very fearful government, a government that's afraid of this, the same sort of government that monopolizes the media that you already have. And you also see it with right wings, you see it with Berita Harian, The Star, Fox News, when there's no incentive for them to show countervailing views in status quo. It's never credible because it's only reflective of what the current government wants. And it's something that society can see, ladies and gentlemen. This sort of climate distrust already exists in status quo without times of emergency. But you add that on with a failing government, especially the fault of the governments and the lies from the governments, and you see the brainwashing that the governments are already doing, ladies and gentlemen. It enhances the climate of distrust that already exists. Now, what they want to do now is keep people in the dark, and we feel that all you do is you perpetuate this sort of distrust and you heighten the panic. So all you're doing here is heightening the panic, especially. But we tell you social media also has a self-regulatory system to maintain accuracy, because it's not just about the numbers that you see in Twitter, like Opening Opposition says, but it's also about the friends that you have on Twitter or the friends that you have on Facebook, because you never follow people that you don't, you might follow people you don't know, but you're never friends on Facebook with people that you don't know past 2 to 3 degrees of friendship, ladies and gentlemen. You know the individual, you're able to judge the credibility of the information as well. People may lie, ladies and gentlemen, but the judgment that you have, given that the trust of the community is far wider, and it allows you, and it ensures the sort of accuracy. Before that, anyone?
So you want people to make decisions with a rational mind you, with the things that could possibly be true with the internet, where they just could listen to the state and cooperate like good citizens and get over the national emergency.
That moves on to the second idea about how you ensure unity. We've already shown you how there's already a climate of distrust, and then you block out information from people. We tell you that all you're going to do is heighten the sort of panic, so that doesn't exist under your paradigm. But the second thing that he wants to do is, how does he ensure unity in these times? And that's something that we'll look at. They call it state-sanctioned panic. We tell you how, because you're leaving them in the dark. You're allowing the climate of distrust to seep in. And the state then blocks you out as well. We tell you that all you're doing is you're activating the survival mode between individuals. And you sort of create that us versus them, because you don't trust the government as well. You reduce credibility and you increase pessimism towards the government, especially in times like this, where you would need trust within the government, ladies and gentlemen. The converse on our side tells you that the government allows or demonstrates an openness or willingness to countervailing views. It also shows that the government's liberal, and it's also choice averse in allowing individuals to have the choice to show, ladies and gentlemen. We also think that it's more progressive under that side. they tell you that, oh, ISIS is behaving on social media, but that allows individuals to then judge. It also allows for international action to happen. It also allows for locals, ladies and gentlemen, to mobilize forces against them. And we tell you that exists under our paradigm. But CG's objective then is also to say, let's leave emergency as fast as possible. We don't think that this side of the house has any form of action standard or anything can come up with this, because all you're doing is just in heightening this sort of disunity, and especially in times like this is something that we cannot stand for. With that, I think.
And